One rule that's been frustrating RVers about RV parks might be changing a little bit. The 10-year rule. You've probably heard about it by now. It's a rule that requires RVs to be 10 years or newer, or you can't get into the resort. Well, there's a lot of reasoning behind that, and there's a lot of over exaggeration about that. But that rule actually is changing a bit at campgrounds across America. This is RV Miles. Throughout this big RV boom that's been going on, actually ever since before the pandemic, there's been a lot of people going to campgrounds. Campgrounds have been seeing lots and lots of reservations. When I say campgrounds, I mean all sorts of accommodations for campers, whether that be RV parks, resorts, or your state or national park campground, whatever it might be. Because parks have been so well booked, they've had a lot of leeway to make rules and decide who they want and who they don't. And we've seen a huge expansion in the number of places that exclude certain types of RVers. Just do a Google search. You wouldn't believe how many luxury motor coach resorts there are now that only allow Class A motorhomes. Some of them even have length limits where you're not allowed into the resort if your RV is under a certain length. It's really silly. And these rules can be very off-putting to customers, even if they qualify. So the big one that people have been talking about for many years now is something called the 10-year rule. And this isn't something that is set in stone, that is copied everywhere, that it's exactly the same. It's different all over the place. But essentially, the idea is if your RV is 10 years or older, a certain resort might not allow it in. Now, I want you to take a look at these RVs. Which one of them is over 10 years old? I'll give you a second. Got it? None of them. They're all over 10 years old. And that's the big problem that a lot of people have with this kind of rule is they think, well, I'm buying an RV now. It's 5 years old and it's going to be 10 years old in 5 years. It's really expensive. I spent $200,000 on this big Class A motorhome. It's used, but it's gorgeous. It used to cost $400,000 or $500,000. Will I really not be able to take this into some of the big resorts that I want to go to in a few years? If so, maybe I'm not going to buy it at all. Well, there have been lots of places with that policy. And I will say, a few years ago, we covered this on the RV Miles podcast. And when we did, I did a whole bunch of research on the different places that I could find on the internet that had a rule like this. I did that again right now. And what I'm finding is a lot of differences from when I looked last time. We're going to get to that in a second. But first, this episode is sponsored by our friends over at Timbren. If you're tired of a sagging rear end and a bumpy ride, introducing Timbren SES, the revolutionary suspension enhancement system for towing your RV. The additional load added to your truck while towing can result in squat and instability. Timbren SES keeps your vehicle level and improves handling. The progressive rubber spring design absorbs shocks and vibrations, providing a smoother, more controlled ride. It's simple to install and requires zero maintenance. Upgrade your driving experience with Timbren SES and pick up a kit at Timbren.com. Your RV adventure awaits today. Okay, so here's what I did. I combed the internet to find as many different RV resort policies as I could that mentioned the age of the RV. And I found over 50 of them. That's kind of where I stopped. And what I found is, instead of what I saw a few years ago, is that the vast majority of these policies now list caveats. So here's an example. RVs must be in good visual condition, and we reserve the right to request photos for units that are over 10 years old. Older rigs, 10 plus years, may be subject to inspection or require approval. Units older than 10 years must submit photos for approval to ensure they meet resort standards. We require RVs to be 10 years old and newer unless management grants an exception based on condition and appearance. They all are now saying this, where in the past, it might have just been RVs must be 10 years or newer. And the point was never to actually restrict to just RVs 10 years or newer. There's a lot of people out there that are saying that this is an insurance requirement or something like that. And there are some truths to that. A lot of these resorts want to make sure that you have a modern electrical system. And if you've got an RV that was built in the 70s, it might not. And they want to check that and make sure it's okay. In general, they really want to make sure that you have an RVIA sticker, that it's been built to RVIA standards. But the idea here all along was, how can we not have junkers in our park? And look, that's a very subjective term. Lots of people are going to have lots of opinions as to what that looks like. But we do know, something like a Cousin Eddie from Christmas Vacation, a lot of parks don't want something like that there. And it's not just about appearances. It's not just about saying we don't want this to look like an ugly place. It's not about saying we don't want those people there. Usually, sometimes it is that, especially those motor coach resorts. But usually it's about they don't want to be responsible for that RV when it gets abandoned. Because what happens a lot of times is someone rolls up into that park with an RV that they paid $700 for, and it stops running and they can't afford the tow, so they just abandon it. And then that park is responsible for dealing with it. They're responsible not only for getting rid of it, but there's a whole process involved because it's not their property. It got abandoned on their property. They don't own it though. It's a titled vehicle. They can't just throw it away. There's a whole lot of stuff and it costs them a lot of money. And as you can imagine, this is a problem more often than not at seasonal resorts or places where people live full time or month to month, year round, or through the winter. Of course, there is a housing issue in this country. And even if it wasn't a big issue, there would still be people doing this where they don't have a lot of money and they buy something cheap and they're trying to live wherever they can. An RV park might not be requiring them to go through all the background checks, which is a whole nother subject we could get into at another time. But they might be finding a place where they can be accepted, where they're having a hard time elsewhere. They don't have the money to do it elsewhere. This is unfortunately the reality. And often the RV park is left to deal with the scraps of that. And sometimes somebody ends up living somewhere for 30 years and their rig might have looked great one day. And 25 years later, it doesn't. So they put rules and policies in here to be able to make decisions about these things. But the big reason that 10-year policies existed, and it's not just 10 years, some of them have a 15-year policy. I've even seen 20. The big reason that exists is to just allow the person at the front desk to save face. So they don't have to say, your RV is too ugly, you can't come in. It allows them to just say, I'm sorry, your RV is 10 years or older, you cannot come in. Now, that's the big change I'm seeing, okay? So we used to see that rule on websites. And now I think there's been a lot of flack against that rule. I kind of trolled through some campground owner Facebook groups and found a lot of discussion about this, where somebody might have called in or they might have left a message or sent an email after they were asked if their RV was 10 years or newer. They might have said, hey, you know what? We don't know that we want to be at a park that excludes people like that. Because every RV owner sees themselves as somebody who might own an RV that's over 10 years old someday. They don't want to go to a resort that's got that kind of attitude. It's kind of a signal to people sometimes that, oh, they might be a pain in the butt about a lot of other things. And we've all seen that, where you go to all these different resorts and campgrounds, and some of them have their own weird, nitpicky little rules that aren't really something that all the other campgrounds out there have. But this is just the way this park likes to do it. And of course, they're free to do that. But for us RVers, sometimes something like this is a signal that, hey, maybe we are not going to be either welcomed here or comfortable here, or we're just not going to have a good time because we're going to be worried about our kids playing around. We're going to be worried about our dogs. I think this 10-year rule really signified lots of different things to people. So now what we're seeing is some of those things that I read off before. There's a caveat, and that caveat was usually there before. If an RV park listed this rule, your RV must be 10 years or newer, usually you could call them and say, hey, can you make an exception for me? Can I send you some pictures? My rig looks really good. You won't even know the difference. And 95% of the time, they were fine with that. That was always the plan. But now I think RV parks realize, hey, this is putting people off. And hey, we don't have as many people coming in as before. RV park reservations are down. So they're now adding some of these caveats to the language on the website. So now my question is, why say the age at all? Why say RVs 10 years or older must be in good condition? Why not just say that about all of them? Now, the flip side of this is I do think more and more resorts are now adding this policy. It's more flexible. They're making it clearer. But I do think more and more resorts have this policy now. But you may never have come across it. And that might have a lot to do with where you camp, because the places that have this policy are generally places where you find long-term camping, whether that be seasonal or year-round, in some of the warm, popular winter destinations. You're going to find lots of places with this policy in Florida, in Arizona, in California, places where people flock for the winter, and places where, frankly, sometimes it's very expensive to own a home. We went through something similar back when we owned a school bus conversion. We built our own school bus conversion when we started our RVing journey. And we found that places that had that 10-year rule were generally going to be places that don't allow a school bus conversion. And some of the places we would have to call up and ask them because they wouldn't list it on their website. So we call up and ask them, and they'd say, yeah, can you just send us some photos? We just have to make sure because look, we've had people come in with an old school bus they bought for $1,500 and they threw a couch in the back of it and they stayed here for a winter. And when they couldn't get it to run when it was time to leave, they left it behind. And you know what it costs to tow a really heavy school bus? It costs a lot. And usually that thing is going to sit there for a while they figure out all the legal ramifications behind removing it. And maybe even the same resort might have different policies for their nightly renters than they do for their long-term renters because they want to make sure that their long-term renters are keeping that long-term section of the park looking fairly nice. And it's also a safety concern. Obviously, they don't want an RV burning down that causes another RV to burn down. And then perhaps there's some liability placed on them, all that sort of stuff. So there is some reasoning behind some of this, but don't be scared. If you're considering buying an RV that's 10 years old or older, if you own one that is coming up on that, don't be worried. The vast majority of people are not going to have a problem with this unless you are a snowbird that goes south for the winter. Then you might have a little bit more limited park availability, but it's not going to be as bad as you think. It's still very, very possible. So I applaud the campgrounds and RV resorts that are adding a little bit more clarity to this policy and making it something that we all understand. Generally, if our rig is 10 years old or older, we might have to send in photos to let them know it looks good. They might even want to inspect it. Some of these I found, they say they might want to like come in, look inside and, make sure your electrical is all correct and everything. So I do understand parks wanting to limit that in some way and protect themselves in some way. And it's not as easy as just saying, we reserve the right to refuse anybody because that puts your staff in a really awkward position. I get it. So I'd love to know in the comments what you think about the 10-year rule, if you've experienced it, if you like it, if you hate it, if it's been a problem for you. And remember, if you want to support the content we do, consider becoming a Mile Marker member. It's $7 a month or $70 a year, and we give you some bonus extras as a thank you. I do a weekly newsletter with all the stories that didn't make my news roundup videos. We have additional podcast episodes weekly and a whole lot more. You can find it over at rvmiles.com/milemarkers or at the link in the description. Thanks so much for being here, everybody, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.